tiempo disfrutamos de este amor. Nuestras almas se acercaron tanto así que yo guardo tu sabor, pero tú llevas también sabor a mí. Sin negar a mi presencia en tu vivir, bastaría con abrazarte, conversar. Tanta vida yo te di que por fuerza llevas ya sabor a mí. No pretendo ser tu dueña, no soy nada, yo no tengo vanidad. De mi vida doy lo bueno, soy tan pobre que otra cosa puedo dar, pasará. Más de 1000 años, muchos o más. Yo no sé si tenga amor la eternidad, pero allá, tal como aquí, en tu boca llevarás un sabor a mí. Sabor a mí. Sabor a mí. Sabor a mí. Sabor a mí, yeah. Sabor a mí, yeah. Sabor a mí. Sabor a mí.
First of all, thank you all for coming. My name is Novel Idea, and this is Myra Nolasco, and we are, I guess I can say we are Black Banana. I guess we're all Black Banana in some way. As Nitin mentioned, we had a class with him last semester, and the class was called Art, Media, and Conflict Post-Genocide. And in that class, we explored historical issues of genocide through the lens of contemporary art in the region. We went to galleries, we had guest speakers, we explored at length the notion of historical memory and how we might contextualize that with regard to curation in the region. During this exploration, I had this realization that there was something missing. Indeed, for me, it was a glaring discrepancy with regard to the representation of Afro-Latino artists. Now, I didn't want to be that black woman in the class, but I couldn't help myself. Now, I'm not Afro-Latino, I can't speak Spanish. I'm Black American. But I know that my link is that, the link that I have with Afro-Latinos is the African diasporic experience of the effects of slavery and colonization. The perception of absence of Afro-Latino representation left us no choice but to investigate it further, that there was no perception of it, right? So we had to investigate it. We actually had some pushback in our classes from the people that were of Latin American descent. What they said was that race was not an issue in Latin America. Yes. And that's because of this whole mestizo ideal, the mixture of races. So what they said to me was that the dynamics of race are totally different in Central America compared to the US. because of this mixture. That didn't fly very well with me. So, in fact, it encouraged our research more. So we did papers and we did proposals and we had this whole academic approach. But at the end of the day, it came down to one question. And it was that one question that got people on board. And that question was, if there is not a problem of race in regards to curation, name for me one curated artist in Guatemala in the contemporary art context. Just one. Now I know there's some out there, but no one could name one. And we hadn't seen one. So we figured that there was a gap there that needed to be explored. So that's what Black Banana is really all about. We want to find those artists, we want to curate them, if not in a gallery setting, in these kinds of settings. We also want to open up that dialogue about race and curation, indeed about the whole racial issue, the whole cultural conversation of inclusion. I'd like to, Amilcar, get your thoughts about what we, and Amilcar, get your response to what you saw on the screen there with Pablo from your perspective.
So in Latin America, there's, and then one part of it hit the nail on the head, is about 150 to 200 million Afro-Latinos in Latin America and the Caribbean. The numbers in Central America, though, were off. In Panama, for example, where we're from, the number's not 14% by no stretch of the imagination. It's more like 50%. In Costa Rica, similarly, no, not 50%, but it's at least double what that was. It's about probably 14 to 60%. Some of the other countries is higher. One of the main reasons why those numbers have come out so low is that there has historically been an effort to not count people of African descent in censuses in Latin America. In a lot of places there haven't been censuses. In Bolivia there hasn't been a census. There hasn't been a census for like 60 years. In war-torn areas such as Guatemala, El Salvador, et cetera, there haven't been censuses for many years. But that aside, there has been a concerted effort over the decades to omit people of African descent from the census count. So for example, there are what's called rounds of censuses in Latin America every 10 years, right? And here as well. In Panama, the last round was in 2010. One of the main issues that we had, and some of the folks that were working on that census issue were relatives of mine, folks that I've grown up with, et cetera, et cetera. And this is translated in Argentina, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Peru, is that there was an undercount that was the result of one, not including civil society in the count process, but also there wasn't enough preparation. There was an undercount, but there wasn't an inclusion of civil society, and the questions that were posed were very subjective, and the questions themselves weren't created with the thought process that civil society people working in these communities conceptualize these things. So as a result, there's been a severe undercount, and every country has been trying, or the movements in every country have been trying to get those counts rectified. In Panama right now, we're working on dealing with that issue because it's a political issue. At the end of the day, your voice, the numbers implicate public policy, allocation of funding, things like that. So that's one thing. The other thing was the comment that these movements have come about are kind of new. They're not new by any stretch of the imagination. Some of the oldest rebellions and revolutions in the Western Hemisphere started in Latin America in the 16th and 17th century. And for example, a more contemporary perspective in Brazil, the Black Power movement in Brazil started in the 1930s, right? So the present, I say all of this to say there's a present incarnation of the Afro-Latino movement in Latin America and the Caribbean. And that has been probably came about around late 90s, 2000, which is the result of the Durban Conference on Racism, Discrimination, and Xenophobia that came about in 2001. Before that, it was in the 60s and 70s. Before that, it was in the 40s, and before that, it was in the 1800s. So those are the two things. With respect to Pablo Jose, I agree that that it's not so much about numbers. Kind of going back to what I was saying about the census. Because like I said, in Panama, for example, it's 50%, and there's still very little artistic representation. So 1%, 2%, and in that respect, I agree with him. It's what the powers that be choose to portray their country's image as. Art art is typically exported, right? It is digested, it is ingested internally, right? And it is a way to foster national spirit, but it is also an exportation of what people want you to be perceived as. And if the powers that be do not want a particular country to be perceived in a certain way, they're not going to export that particular image. The same goes for advertising, which some people consider that a form of art or of expression. So it kind of goes along the same vein.